It began with festering sores, secret visits to court physicians, and whispered rumors behind gilded doors. A silent plague crept through the corridors of power, devouring the minds and bodies of kings and queens while the world watched their grandeur, oblivious to their rot. This is the tale of royalty brought low not by daggers or war, but by a venereal disease that once swept Europe like a wildfire. Syphilis. Beneath the silks, behind the jewels, and inside the bedchambers of dynasties, it festered, destroying legacies, unmaking empires, and leaving behind only madness, disfigurement, and silence. Welcome to the harrowing true story of 5 royals whose lives were ravaged by syphilis, a disease that did not discriminate between beggar and blue blood. The pox that shaped empires. A brief history of syphilis in royal Europe. Syphilis first erupted in Europe in the late 15th century, likely brought back from the New World by the returning soldiers of Columbus, or spread by the French armies during the invasion of Naples. Known by many names, the French disease to Italians, the Neapolitan disease to the French, and the Christian disease to the Ottoman, syphilis quickly became a widespread and deadly force, killing and crippling millions across centuries. Unlike the plague, which struck in sudden, sweeping waves, syphilis was a slow burn. In its earliest stage, it would appear as a painless sore, but left untreated, it would blossom into a grotesque torment: skin lesions, bone decay, dementia, and eventual death. Treatment was brutal. Mercury was the common prescription. A night in the arms of Venus leads to a lifetime on Mercury, went the cruel saying. Unfortunately, the toxic cure often proved deadlier than the disease. And yet, even among the wealthiest and most protected classes of Europe, syphilis spared no one. In fact, the royal courts, with their interwoven family lines and hedonistic lifestyles, proved to be fertile ground for the disease. Royal physicians would mask symptoms under vague diagnoses: nervous fever, general paralysis of the insane, or simply madness. But modern historians and forensic scientists now believe that many of history's most powerful rulers were, in fact, slowly being destroyed by syphilis. Case 1. Henry VIII, England's most famous tyrant, possibly ravaged by the pox. Henry VIII is remembered for his 6 wives, his brutal execution of 2 of them, and his founding of the Church of England. But beneath the political thunder and matrimonial drama lay a man possibly tormented by a syphilitic curse. Though no contemporary doctor ever formally diagnosed Henry VIII with syphilis, many historians now suspect he suffered from it based on a trail of symptoms and whispers. Chronic leg ulcers, violent mood swings, paranoia, impotence in later life, and signs of cognitive decline all match the disease's profile. His sudden transformation from the golden, athletic prince of his youth into a bloated, belligerent tyrant may have had more to do with internal rot than pure ambition. Henry's medical records were either destroyed or heavily sanitized by court officials. Yet accounts from foreign ambassadors describe a king in his later years who was grotesquely swollen, stinking with infection, and so mentally unbalanced that courtiers feared to speak his name in full. His 4th wife, Anne of Cleves, reportedly refused to consummate the marriage, claiming his members were inadequate, perhaps diseased. He annulled that union within months, adding weight to the theory. Many nobles of Henry's court were documented as having syphilis, and his fondness for mistress, especially in his youth, makes the transmission plausible. Moreover, some historians speculate that the miscarriages and early deaths of many of his children, including with his beloved Jane Seymour, might have been caused by congenital syphilis, a known outcome when the disease is passed from parent to child in the womb. Was Henry's brutal tyranny born of divine right, or a decaying brain riddled with bacteria? Case 2. Ivan the Terrible, Russia's first Tsar, consumed by madness and disease. The eyes of Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible, were said to burn with a fury no one could withstand. His reign was one of terror, blood, and paranoia. Personally beat his pregnant daughter-in-law and murdered his own son with a staff. For centuries, historians attributed his savagery to pure megalomania, but medical historians now suggest a darker possibility. Ivan may have suffered from advanced syphilis. Ivan's reign, 1547–1584, was marked by both brilliance and unspeakable cruelty. He modernized Russia's military, centralized authority, and expanded the empire. But he also built the Oprichnina, brutal, secret police force that terrorized the boyar class and went on long, bloody purges. His behavior grew increasingly erratic with age. Fits of rage, hallucinatory paranoia, public breakdowns, and even bestial violence. One modern theory, bolstered by autopsy results from 1963, posits that Ivan's body had extraordinarily high levels of mercury. While this might be attributed to alchemical medicine or embalming processes, it also aligns with the traditional treatment for syphilis. If Ivan had indeed contracted the disease likely during his years of violent debauchery, it's possible that both the illness and its cure drove him into madness. His monstrous reputation endures. But was Ivan truly a demonor, a man whose brain and soul were being eaten alive from the inside? The disease of kings. The king's disease. The narrative thread tying Henry and Ivan together is chilling. Two emperors whose insatiable power masked an insidious decline. Their brutality, once viewed solely as the result of political ambition, may have stemmed from a festering infection that slowly eroded their minds. But they were not alone. Across Europe, as the Renaissance dawned and the Enlightenment crept into noble salons, syphilis did its work in the shadows. Its symptoms mirrored curses, its progressions mistaken for divine punishment or hereditary madness. Case 3. Louis XIV's heir. The tragedy of the Grand Dauphin. France, under Louis XIV, was a theater of spectacle. The opulence of Versailles dazzled the world. The Sun King shone in golden light, and his court became the heartbeat of European elegance and absolutism. Yet behind the golden gates, the heir to this glittering empire was quietly falling apart. Louis, le Grand Dauphin, the only legitimate son of Louis XIV to reach adulthood, was groomed to inherit a divine crown, but his life would be stunted, not just by the crushing expectations of royal duty, but likely by syphilis. Born in 1661, the Dauphin was never a particularly healthy child. Courtiers described him as physically frail and emotionally timid, awkward, and strangely indifferent to matters of state. He never displayed the commanding charisma of his father, and was often removed from public ceremonies. In adulthood, his condition worsened. By the 1680s, he had developed open sores on his face and neck that no balm could heal. Whispers of the morbus gallicus, the French disease, rippled through Versailles. Despite this, he was married off to a Bavarian princess and sired 3 sons, but 2 of them would die prematurely, and the third would perish in a syphilitic epidemic, continuing the tragic pattern. Some contemporary accounts claimed the Dauphin's breath stank so badly that courtiers could not stand close to him. He was said to suffer from migraines, mental confusion, and extreme fatigue, classical markers of tertiary syphilis. By the end of his life, the Grand Dauphin was a ghost of himself, bloated, partially paralyzed, unable to perform his duties, and increasingly withdrawn. He died in 1711, aged just 49, having never ruled France. Some believe his father, Louis XIV, feared his mental decline and quietly ensured he was kept away from state matters. It was a tragic irony. The Sun King had built an empire of golden illusion, but his legacy crumbled from within, undone by a disease that prestige and wealth could not expel. The Bourbon dynasty, already genetically fragile, was being eaten from the inside by syphilis, passed down quietly through the generations like a curse. Case 4. Don Carlos of Spain. The syphilitic madness of a Habsburg prince. Among the most infamous cases of royal degeneration stands Don Carlos, son of King Philip II of Spain. Born in 1545, into the blood-soaked splendor of the Habsburg dynasty, Don Carlos's life became a morbid cautionary tale, a mixture of inherited madness, suspected syphilis, and dynastic tragedy. From infancy, Carlos displayed alarming deformities: a misshapen skull, a severely twisted spine, and an oversized jaw, grotesque result of centuries of inbreeding among Habsburg royals. But the physical abnormalities were only the beginning. By adolescence, Don Carlos began showing signs of violent psychosis. He beat servants nearly to death, tried to murder a tutor with a brick, and reportedly set fire to a stable full of horses. One court chronicler noted that he was unfit to rule, fit only to be ruled. His behavior grew more erratic: paranoia, hallucinations, violent outbursts, and increasingly self-destructive tendencies, including attempting to gouge out his own eyes and throwing himself down a staircase. Modern scholars suspect these symptoms stemmed from congenital syphilis transmitted in utero by his mother, possibly infected by Philip II himself or another within the court. Congenital syphilis, unlike the acquired version, causes systemic damage from birth, bone malformations, deafness, neurosyphilis, and cognitive impairment. Carlos displayed nearly all of them. But the true tragedy lay in how Spain's most powerful monarch handled his diseased heir. When Don Carlos plotted to flee the palace and perhaps raise a rebellion, Philip took drastic action. In 1568, he had his own son arrested and imprisoned in solitary confinement, where Carlos would endure 6 torturous months of starvation, neglect, and total isolation before dying under mysterious circumstances. Some claimed he was poisoned. Others said he went mad and tore himself apart. Either way, his death ended any hope for the Spanish line's clean continuation and left a moral stain on Philip's reign. Voltaire would later quip, "This prince was born a monster and died a martyr." But the truth may be far more medical than mythic. The royal lineage and the curse of inheritance. Syphilis was not only a disease of sin, it became, in many royal cases, a disease of inheritance passed from father to son, from mother to fetus, through the very bloodlines meant to carry divine rule. And because monarchies relied on purity of lineage, of legacy, of sacred body, the presence of a venereal disease in a prince or princess was a matter of scandal so immense it could not be spoken aloud. Diagnoses were hidden behind euphemisms. Treatments were administered in secret, often under the cover of fevers or melancholia. The consequence? Generations of damaged rulers, incapable of governing with clarity or compassion. The Habsburgs and Bourbons, 2 of the mightiest houses in European history, suffered tremendous losses due to this hidden plague. Stillbirths, miscarriages, sudden deaths in youth, and inexplicable mental collapses appeared again and again in family trees. The price of monarchy was no longer simply political, it had become pathological. And even as Enlightenment ideas began to spread across Europe, syphilis retained its shadowy grip on the highest echelons of power. In the coming decades, the disease would strike down another royal whose conquests brought him fame, whose downfall brought him exile, and whose body bore the unmistakable scars of infection. Case 5. Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor's secret affliction. Few names command the weight of history like Napoleon Bonaparte. From the windswept shores of Corsica to the icy fields of Russia, he carved his name into the earth with cannon and crown. Emperor, strategist, visionary, Tyranthus' story is one of meteoric rise and catastrophic collapse. But beneath the surface of this mythic life may lie an undiscussed cause for his erratic behavior, declining health, and ultimate ruin: syphilis. Napoleon's personal physicians and later autopsy records reveal a disturbing constellation of symptoms: chronic stomach pains, severe mood swings, skin ulcers, hallucinations, memory lapses, and perhaps most tellingly a lifelong battle with sexual dysfunction. These symptoms, alongside the mercury-based treatments he is known to have received, point clearly toward a probable case of syphilis. The possibility is not without basis. Napoleon led a notoriously promiscuous life, especially in his early military years. He had numerous lovers throughout France and beyond, some from the brothels of Paris, others from aristocratic circles. His first wife, Josephine de Beauharnais, was herself a noted courtesan. Before marrying him, rumors long suggested she may have been the source of his infection. Though she bore him no children, a fact that troubled him deeply, her continued presence in his life hints at a complicated and possibly sexually restrained relationship, especially in later years. After marrying the much younger Marie-Louise of Austria, Napoleon finally had a legitimate heir, the King of Rome. However, his sexual performance reportedly declined, and court whispers suggested that his intimate life was brief and mechanical. Even so, the emperor threw himself into empire building with ever-growing instability, his health slowly deteriorating in parallel with his military judgment. His infamous Russian campaign of 1812 often described as a turning point of irrational overreach, coincided with increased reports of physical suffering and mental confusion. As he aged, his body weakened. By the time of his exile on the island of St. Helena, Napoleon was a shadow of his former self. He suffered from insomnia, migraines, fits of depression, and agonizing gastrointestinal pain. His hair fell out in patches. His face, once handsome and intense, grew bloated and pallid. Autopsy reports later showed extensive damage to his stomach and liver, but they also revealed mercury residues in his tissues. Whether administered as a syphilis treatment or part of a failed poisoning attempt remains debated, but the traces remain, like forensic ghosts. In one of his final recorded conversations, he reportedly muttered, "I die before my time, killed by the English oligarchy and their assassins." But in truth, it may have been his own pastis, own blood, that was killing him. Napoleon's body was strong, his mind sharper than any general of his time, but if syphilis had wormed its way into his nervous system, it might explain the decline in judgment, the erratic decisions, and the aching loneliness that haunted him in exile. Like so many kings before him, the emperor had conquered continents, but not the disease within, a pattern of power and collapse. By the early 19th century, syphilis had earned a reputation as the great imitator, mimicking countless other diseases and defying easy diagnosis. It crept into the bones, into the mind, into the reproductive lineage, and in the case of the powerful, into history itself. Among the 5 royals examined, Henry VIII, Ivan the Terrible, the Grand Dauphin, Don Carlos, and Napoleon Bonaparte find a haunting pattern. Each began their lives with promise or power. Each descended into violence, madness, isolation, or death, and each bore, in their flesh and fate, the likely mark of syphilis. The disease was never spoken aloud in official records. It was considered too shameful, too vulgar for the annals of royal biography. Instead, doctors recorded vague euphemisms: exhaustion, dropsy, nervous illness, melancholia. And yet, modern medicine has peeled back the veil. Neurosyphilis, especially in its late stage, causes hallucinations, rage, depression, psychosis, and physical decay. It is now clear that some of the greatest political collapses in European history may have had microbial roots. Imagine the unthinkable, that the religious Reformation in England, the terror of the Russian Oprichniki, the succession crisis of the Bourbons, the Spanish Inquisition's paranoia, and even the fall of Napoleon's empire were not just caused by ambition or ideology, but by bacteria passed during an intimate encounter. The silent spread in royal courts. Royalty, in their age-old practice of marrying within a small pool of noble bloodlines, created closed systems where diseases spread unchecked. But with syphilis, it wasn't just a matter of lineage, it was lifestyle. The court culture of early modern Europe was one of sensual indulgence. Grand masquerades, private salons, and whispered affairs behind tapestries were not anomalies. They were the norm. Courtiers were expected to seduce and be seduced, and monarchs, drunk on divine right, often treated fidelity as an insult to their station. Doctors, themselves under threat of royal displeasure, had little power to intervene or reveal the truth. Their treatments, often involving mercury, guaiacum, or steaming baths, were both ineffective and dangerous. Sometimes, patients were cured only to relapse in horrific ways. Sometimes, they died not from the disease, but from its remedy. And always, the records were burned. The legacy of syphilis in royal courts was not merely medical, it was historical. It altered the paths of dynasties, reshaped politics, and created ghost thrones where heirs were too sick or too mad to rule. The disease did not respect gold or scepters. It cared only for flesh. Case 6. Ludwig II of Bavaria, the Swan King and the Madness Within. Among Europe's royal eccentrics, few figures rival the legend of Ludwig II of Bavaria, the enigmatic Mad King, whose dreamlike castles now draw millions of tourists. But beneath the soaring spires of Neuschwanstein and the moonlit gondola rides through artificial caves, Ludwig was descending into a dark and lonely abyss. While romanticized as a misunderstood visionary, recent medical reassessments suggest a far grimmer possibility. Ludwig's madness may have been the product of neurosyphilis. Born in 1845, Ludwig was groomed to become King of Bavaria during a period of immense cultural and political upheaval. From a young age, he exhibited traits that baffled his tutors. He was reclusive, imaginative, emotionally distant, and obsessed with romantic mythology. He idolized Richard Wagner to an unhealthy degree, pouring vast amounts of state money into the composer's career and surrounding himself with Wagnerian art and ideals. At first, Ludwig's behavior was dismissed as poetic, but as the years passed, it became undeniably erratic. He isolated himself entirely from court, communicated only through written notes, and began constructing elaborate fantasy castles at astronomical costs, some modeled after medieval legends, others based on scenes from operas. Meanwhile, he neglected governance almost entirely. Ministers rarely saw him. He developed insomnia, paranoia, and increasingly delusional fixations, once ordering a stage production performed entirely for himself at 3 a.m. to an empty audience hall. In 1886, things took a dramatic turn. Without his knowledge, Ludwig's own cabinet summoned 4 psychiatrists who declared him insane without direct examination. They cited bizarre expenditures, royal absenteeism, and witness testimonies of hallucinations and grandiose delusions. That same month, he was deposed. Just days later, Ludwig was found dead in Lake Starnberg alongside his doctor under murky circumstances. Officially, it was ruled a suicide by drowning, but Ludwig was a strong swimmer, and no water was found in his lungs. Some believe he was murdered to prevent a scandal. Others suggest a desperate escape gone wrong. But what of the disease? Recent medical historians, piecing together his symptoms and behavior, have pointed to neurosyphilis as the likely culprit. Ludwig is known to have frequented brothels in his youth despite his increasingly repressed and troubled sexuality. His relationships were largely dysfunctional, and he seemed both attracted to and terrified of physical intimacy. If he had contracted syphilis during this time and failed to receive treatment, perhaps out of fear or denial, it is entirely plausible that the infection reached his brain. Neurosyphilis can lie dormant for years before erupting with devastating neurological symptoms: insomnia, mania, confusion, delusions, even seizures. Ludwig's downward spiral matches this pattern uncannily. Even more tellingly, his death was hastily followed by the removal and destruction of many of his personal effects and documents, including medical records. The royal family had a vested interest in preserving Ludwig's image not as diseased, but as tragically mad. Madness, romance, and the medical truth. Ludwig II's legacy today is largely romantic. His castles, especially Neuschwansteinhof, inspired fairy tales and Disney fantasies. He is remembered as the Swan King, a gentle soul misunderstood by the harshness of modern politics. But this idealization obscures a more painful truth. Like Don Carlos, like the Grand Dauphin, like Ivan and Napoleon, Ludwig may have been a man trapped by both his blood and a disease that shredded his mind from within. His obsession with myth was not simply artistic, was a refuge, a sanctuary against the nightmare creeping into his brain. He died a broken man. Bavaria mourned, but the doctors who examined him, and those who tried to erase their findings, left behind fragments of a medical tragedy buried in political necessity. A disease of shame, a history of silence. Syphilis, particularly in its late neurological stage, was more than a physical affliction. It was a destroyer of identities. In a world where royalty ruled by divine mandate, to admit that a king or heir had contracted a venereal disease was to invite national disgrace. And so, the truth was buried. Again and again. Records were burned, diagnoses rewritten, corpses embalmed beyond examination. Symptoms were masked with words like melancholy, madness, weakness of the spirit. In many cases, royal physicians were complicit, whether to protect dynasties or to preserve their own heads. But historians now know the signs: chronic ulcers, paranoia, mood swings, infertility, sudden deaths in royal children, grandiose delusions, and inexplicable violence. Behind these patterns lies an unmistakable fingerprint, the shadow of syphilis. The disease played no favorites. It invaded brothels and ballrooms alike. And while the poor died on filthy streets, The powerful often lingered, ravaged not by war or poison, but by a slow bacterial collapse. Their suffering changed the course of nations. Legacies shaped by infection. Across this series of cases, one message emerges clearly. Syphilis was not just a medical phenomenon, it was a hidden architect of history. Henry VIII may have reshaped religion and monarchy under the weight of madness and desperation. Ivan the Terrible forged an empire in blood, perhaps under the influence of neurosyphilitic delusion. Don Carlos and the Grand Dauphin were extinguished before they could rule, their bodies and minds too fragile for the throne. Napoleon, the master strategist, may have been undone not by Wellington, but by the creeping fog in his own mind. And Ludwig II, the Swan King, built castles not to rule but to escape. The forgotten victims, royal women and the inherited curse. In the chronicles of power, royal women have long been relegated to secondary roles, seen as mothers of heirs, symbols of alliances, or pawns in dynastic games. Yet when it comes to syphilis, they were often the primary victims, infected by their husbands, silenced by court decorum, and blamed for the miscarriages, deformities, or madness of their children. Their suffering was both personal and political, written not in official histories but in hushed rumors and sealed medical records. Some bore the disease's physical horrors: miscarriages, stillbirths, deformities, dementia. Others endured its emotional toll, isolated, disfigured, driven mad by both the illness and the suffocating confines of their gilded prisons. One such tragic figure is Empress Augusta of Saxony, wife to Frederick Augustus II, whose court was known for its libertine culture in the early 19th century. Letters from her chambermaids speak of strange rashes, prolonged fevers, and a slow mental decline. Though her official death was marked as nervous fatigue, the symptoms described strongly resemble those of secondary syphilis: skin eruptions, joint pain, and blurred vision. Worse still was the fate of Queen Joanna of Castile, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, often referred to as Juana la Loca. Joanna the Mad. Her descent into mental instability is legendary. While historians typically attribute her madness to genetic predisposition and trauma, some now suggest that congenital syphilis may have played a role. Her husband, Philip the Handsome of Burgundy, was widely promiscuous. If he contracted syphilis and passed it to her, whether through sexual contact or through infected bloodlines, Joanna's strange seizures, hallucinations, and decades of incoherent confinement could align with neurosyphilitic symptoms. She spent the last 46 years of her life locked in a convent, reportedly talking to the air, refusing to bathe, and claiming to see angels and demons. The image of a queen, once beloved, reduced to an apparition in a locked tower, is haunting and emblematic of syphilis's most insidious legacy. The children of syphilis, a silent line of death. Perhaps the most heartbreaking consequence of syphilis in royal families was its impact on royal children, many of whom never lived to be kings or queens. Congenital syphilis could cause miscarriages, stillbirths, deformities, and early death. Those who survived often displayed facial malformations, joint issues, deafness, or mental impairment. In the case of Henry VIII, several of his children by multiple wives died in infancy or were stillborn. While these tragedies were blamed on God's will or the supposed failings of the Queen, historians now suggest congenital syphilis as a likely cause. If Henry himself carried the infection and passed it to his wives, the repeated loss of male heirs becomes medically plausible. Similarly, Louis XIV's dynasty was plagued with early deaths, with the Grand Dauphin's sons dying young or being unfit to rule. Syphilis may have coursed silently through the Bourbon bloodline, robbing France of 3 generations of potential monarchs. The throne ultimately passed to a child, the future Louis XV, only 5 years old, after syphilis and smallpox wiped out everyone between him and power. It is no exaggeration to say that an entire kingdom's fate shifted because of one man's infection. Silence, scandal, and the vanishing diagnosis. What makes syphilis particularly dangerous in historical study is how well it was hidden. Royal physicians used code words in their journals, avoided direct language in autopsy reports, and ensured public documents reflected only dignified causes of death: consumption, dropsy, nervous disease. Even when the signs were glaring: body sores, insanity, disfigurement, truth was rarely admitted. Take the case of King George III of Britain, long believed to have suffered from porphyria. Yet some now believe his mental collapse, his rambling speeches, wild behavior, and paranoid delusions might be explained by tertiary syphilis. While the porphyria theory is still the dominant view, recent genetic and psychological re-examinations raise the possibility that an undiagnosed infection contributed to his decline. George's fits of mania were so severe, he had to be restrained with straitjackets. At times he babbled incoherently for hours, imagined himself conversing with long-dead monarchs, and howled in pain through the night. Whatever the true cause, his decline left Britain functionally without a monarch for years, forcing Parliament to create a regency. Whether syphilis played a role or not, the mere possibility illustrates how deeply the disease wormed itself into the fabric of royal history and how eager monarchies were to bury it. When power couldn't protect you, syphilis was a cruel equalizer. It infected beggars and emperors alike. But for the royal infected, the cost wasn't just physical, it was dynastic. These were people raised to believe themselves divine, ordained by God, born into bloodlines of destiny, and yet, behind closed doors they withered, their minds unraveled, their children died, their bodies betrayed them in ways their titles could not shield. The very instruments of power, secrecy, wealth, lineage, became weapons against them, preventing diagnosis, treatment, and even sympathy. Unlike peasants who died openly in the streets, royals died in silence. They were hidden away in castles, monasteries, or gilded tombs, their suffering denied, and their dignity preserved on parchment only. But history remembers, and through modern eyes, we can now read between the lines. The final case. A royal corpse speaks. In 2007, a team of researchers exhumed the body of Francis II of France, who died in 1560 at the age of 16 after a short reign. His death was attributed to an ear infection, but forensic study of his remains found bone lesions consistent with congenital syphilis, and his malformed skull bore signs of cranial pressure and infection symptoms often linked to syphilitic encephalitis. Francis had been married to Mary, Queen of Scots, who would go on to her own tragic fate. If Francis indeed carried syphilis from birth, it raises the chilling prospect that the disease nearly reached the throne of England again through dynastic union. History is not just shaped by battles and treaties. It is shaped by disease, by microscopic invaders that twist fate as surely as any sword. And nowhere was this truer than among the royals who ruled, suffered, and died often without ever knowing what devoured them. The rotten crown. How syphilis changed the course of empires. What if the key to understanding the collapse of dynasties isn't found in dusty treaties or battlefield maps, but in autopsy reports, private letters, and the slow decay of once powerful minds? Syphilis, the great imitator, didn't just alter the health of monarchs. It reshaped the history of Europe from within. With no regard for rank or crown, it seeped into courts and bedrooms, hiding behind wigs and velvet until it surfaced in madness, infertility, or early death. The disease penetrated the very architecture of political power, destabilizing successions, weakening ruling lines, and sometimes rendering monarchs incapable of coherent rule. What might have happened had Henry VIII produced a robust, long-lived male heir? What if Ivan the Terrible's mind had remained intact? Would the Bourbon line have survived the French Revolution if its heirs had not been so fragile, so easily extinguished? Would Spain's global empire have endured if not for Don Carlos's monstrous decline and the psychological trauma left in his wake? These are not idle questions. They are the hidden cracks in the foundations of royal power hairline fractures carved by Treponema pallidum, the spiral-shaped bacterium that caused syphilis. From royal shame to public health crisis. Syphilis's royal victims remained mostly hidden during their lifetimes, but by the 19th century, the disease had become a public health crisis. Soldiers, merchants, and colonists carried it to every continent, from Africa to Asia to the Americas. Its symptoms were horrifying: flesh-eating lesions, collapsed noses, deformed infants. As the condition spread, it forced the medical world to evolve. Hospitals began tracking venereal diseases. Specialized wards were opened. The medical community, finally breaking through centuries of stigma, began treating syphilis as a public matter, not just a personal shame. Still, it wasn't until the early 20th century that real breakthroughs occurred. In 1905, the German scientist Fritz Schauden identified the spirochete bacterium responsible. And just 5 years later, in 1910, Paul Ehrlich developed salvarsan, the first effective treatment for syphilis, though still harsh and incomplete. But it would be penicillin, discovered in 1928 and refined for public use in the 1940s, that finally changed the tide. For the first time in human history, syphilis was no longer a life sentence. And yet, its leg, especially in royal history, remains carved into the bones of the past. When blue blood turned to poison, what unites the 5 royal figures in this story is not just infection. It is the consequences of secrecy. Had the truth of their illnesses been acknowledged, history might have unfolded differently. But in a world where kings were God's chosen and queens were vessels of purity, admitting to venereal disease was unthinkable. And so the lies stacked up. Diagnoses were falsified. Letters were burned. Doctors were sworn to silence. Heirs were hidden away in country estates or locked in monasteries. What should have been medical issues became political catastrophes. These monarchs ruled empires, but could not control the disease within them. They enforced laws and launched wars, but in their private lives, they were powerless. In a brutal irony, the more absolute their rule became, the more completely they were destroyed by a microbe they refused to name. Syphilis and the myth of royal invulnerability. The narrative of kings and queens as superhuman figures imbued with divine right, born into strength and beauty, was always a myth. But syphilis shattered that illusion with particular cruelty. It deformed the face. It twisted the mind. It attacked fertility, intellect, and dignity. When Napoleon's stomach rotted, when Ivan raged through Moscow like a mad dog, when Don Carlos screamed in his cell, when Ludwig II wandered alone through his echoing palaces. These were not just isolated tragedies, they were reminders that flesh is flesh, no matter how many crowns it wears. In the end, syphilis became the great unmasker. It stripped away illusion. It reduced gods to men, emperors to patients, and it exposed, in the harshest way, that royal power could not insulate its owners from the most intimate kind of ruin. The aftermath. What we remember. What we forget. Today, the stories of these royals are often recast as eccentricity, madness, or martyrdom. Henry VIII is remembered as a tyrant with a taste for wives. Ivan is seen as a symbol of cruel absolutism. Napoleon is lionized, even in defeat. Don Carlos is a dark legend. Ludwig II has been transformed into a cultural icon. But beneath these narratives lies a shared medical truth that modern science helps us now understand, though history tried to forget. The legacy of syphilis is not just in ruined bodies, but in rewritten histories. The disease shaped succession crises, fueled revolutions, and contributed to the collapse of monarchies. It changed how medicine was practiced, how mental illness was understood, and how privacy and power interact in the public eye. And though its bacterial spiral is microscopic, its imprint on human history is vast. Closing reflection. A legacy in the blood. Syphilis has faded from the headlines, but not from the bloodstream of the past. Its spiral-shaped trace curls through centuries, through dynasties, through cradles and coffins. It struck the powerful not because they were cursed, but because they were human. And that, in the end, is the most enduring message, that the people who ruled nations were not immune to the world they ruled. Disease, like fate, cared little for crowns. So, the next time you gaze upon the portrait of a serene monarch or walk the echoing halls of a royal castle, remember what history tried to hide. Beneath the brocade and marble, the golden thrones and bloodlines, was something far more fragile, a human body, slowly rotting from the inside. And though their names may shine in textbooks and legends, their real stories, their secret pain, their silent battles lie buried, waiting to be unearthed.